Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Fireside Chat here at the White Museum of the Canadian Rockies, tonight with Ben. Most of you already know Ben and probably have a number of his books. Ben is a very special person in this community, a mountaineer, a writer, and a great advocate for the natural world. And Ben is the naturalist par excellence. So tonight, Ben is going to share some of his stories of his remarkable life. So welcome, Ben.
Thank you. And Chick, I've got to say, I'm really embarrassed to be here. I don't have a beard. I've had a beard since I was 19 because I don't have a chin, so I had to grow this beard. And then when COVID came along, to wear a mask properly, you shouldn't have a beard, really. So people are seeing me kind of naked. If anybody wants to just leave in disgust, feel free. I just thought I better, preface our conversation.
Sure. Well, you look fine without a beard, Ben. It's okay.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Coming from him.
Okay. So the first, when I read your autobiography, Sam and Mary B., your parents, they're big in the book, and so tell us about your mom and dad.
My mother came from Ohio. I grew up in the U.S., right? I'm an ex-Yank. And she came from Ohio. She always referred to where she came from in Springfield, Ohio, which is kind of near Columbus, I guess, or something. She called it the swamps. And we would go back there to visit her parents in the summer, our grandparents, where we realized that it was almost true. It was hot and humid, and you got prickly heat. Does that ring a bell with anybody if you say prickly heat? It's not a term you hear much in Canada. So she wound up marrying this strange fellow from Pennsylvania, my father, Sam Gadd, who really was a fairly strange guy. I mean, you probably got the feeling in reading he was probably nuts, kind of neurotic, but incredibly brilliant. This is a guy who understood James Joyce from one end to the other. This is a guy who could understand Finnegan's Wake, but couldn't get a college degree because he'd always argue with his professors and walk out, So he became a newspaper man and would travel around. But the interesting thing about Sam was that he was a Red, but not a Red in the sense of working for Joseph Stalin or anything. He was a socialist in 1950s McCarthyite America. We suffered. We'd get run out of town, He'd lose his job because the local American Legion boys and remember the John Birch Society? I don't even know if it was around back then, that early, but those sort of types would come after me. And their sons and daughters would beat me up on the playground at school. Growing up in the U.S., I mean, we know what a violent place it is, right? We just had another example of that the other day. That whole culture is shot through with violence from beginning to end, right? Starts right on the playground where the boys all fight. At least they did, in the 50s when I was going to school in places like Grand Junction, Colorado, and Colorado Springs, Colorado. Was so happy to leave that country behind, and we came to a nation that makes sense. This one. Oh, Canada. I mean, it's been a great place to live and work.
Great.
So, sorry, that was way more than about Sam.
Oh, that's okay.
They're both dead. You don't have to worry about them.
No. And what about you? What about young Benny? You were sort of a tall, skinny little kid?
I wasn't tall. I was very short. I was the shortest, skinniest, wimpiest kid in my class, year after year after year. And I always remember grade 7 because we came from 3 elementary schools to a junior high school in Colorado Springs, western part of Colorado Springs. Anybody know Colorado Springs at all? Yeah. Skyway is where we lived, and they had the junior high and the high school together there. And a kid named Tom Lorig was in my class. And thank God he was even skinnier and smaller than I was, which was wonderful. because the bullies would go for him sometimes instead of me, you know.
Yeah.
So I got beaten up a lot. And my dad was a pacifist. And he said, always, don't fight back. Whatever you do, don't fight back. And I'm thinking, you know, if I just learned to throw a punch. But then, think of it this way. If you throw a punch against somebody who's a lot bigger and stronger than you are, which everybody was, the bullies especially, then I may have saved myself serious injury by not fighting back, because I get punched a few times and they'd go away, you know.
Yeah.
Pacifists are right, chick. They really are.
Oh, yeah. And you live for another day.
I live for another day.
Yeah. And of course, your dad was a wordsmith, and you grew up with a real interest in words.
Always did. When other kids were learning the names of all the cars, you know, in their early teens, I was sitting around the fire with my dad. He was an editor, and a really good one. He wound up editing for Encyclopedia Britannica, you know, and medical textbooks and things. He was a brilliant guy. He just knew everything. But we'd sit around the fire, him smoking cigarette after cigarette, and I still associate the odor of a newly lit cigarette with my dad, and I loved it because he'd do that. And then we'd do things like figure out the right noun to use, you know, verb declensions, all this stuff, which nobody seemed to care about but Sam and me. And he turned me into an editor too. I can remember one time, I must have been maybe 14 or 15, and we'd stayed up till 1 a.m., you know, talking about lie and lay or something. And he said, Ben, by this time I was Ben, not Benny, one day you're going to make your living with words. And you know, he was right. He was right. I turned into a writer. He could never follow anything through. He wrote wonderful poems and would never get them published. Do you remember there was a character in Aldous Huxley's novel Island? Anybody ever read that, this sort of utopia novel that Aldous Huxley wrote? It's called Island, and the main character in there describes himself as the man who won't take yes for an answer. That was my dad. He could have done many things, but nope, not doing that.
No.
Yep.
No.
But I'm not like that.
No, well.
I take yes.
Yeah, good. And then because of your dad's disposition this way and his political leanings, you ended up going to Chicago. You got thrown out of Colorado Springs, was it?
We did. He started his own weekly newspaper in Colorado Springs. And he exposed some of the local, capitalisti doing evil things, and suddenly his advertising dried up. No other jobs. He went to work for the trade unions in Colorado Springs for a while, the Building and Trades Council as a secretary. He'd always been a left-winger, you know, and they kind of liked him. But then, this was back in the days when Fidel Castro had just taken over Cuba. And the U.S. hated Fidel Castro. And in Canada, we were easier on him. But I was living in the U.S., and my dad brought in a fellow who'd been to Cuba and saw what Castro was doing. In the early years, you know, he did a lot of good things for the country, no question about it. Education and medicine and all this stuff. And this guy, Harry Nair, who was a lawyer from Denver, went to Cuba, took a bunch of pictures, and was just convinced that the U.S. was totally wrong about Fidel Castro. Well, they were right about him. He wanted United Fruit out of Cuba. but that would have been good for the country. So anyway, he was going around giving talks about this and was immediately labeled a communist and so on. And my dad invited, I met Harry and heard his talk somewhere. And then I wanted him to give his talk in my high school to the Spanish club. This did not fly. The superintendent of schools said, "We're not having that communist in our high school." Yeah, so, we had his talk at my house, which was packed with my fellow students. And I remember the president of the student body, after the talk, crying her eyes out. And somebody asked her, "Laurel, what is it?" She said, "You mean my government has been lying to me?" Disillusionment was instantaneous. And anyway, as a result of that, the trade unions decided my dad was a red and fired him. And the only place he could get work was Chicago, Illinois, with a little hole-in-the-wall encyclopedia, which lasted about 4 months, and then the Encyclopedia Britannica took him on as a senior editor. Yeah, that changed things. But we moved back there for a couple of years.
And you had a really interesting time in your life there.
Yeah, well, see, my dad was raising me to be a radical type, a revolutionary sort of person. And the civil rights movement was on. This was 1963. I spent the summer of 1963 between my junior and senior years in high school. We lived in a lily-white suburb because my mother could not stand to live in the city. So we lived out there, and my dad took the train into work every day. But I was really interested in this, and I went on the civil rights demonstrations and the peace demonstrations, and carried my sign and everything. And in the summer of 1963, I worked for $5 a week for the American Friends Service Committee. Does that ring a bell with anybody? Those are the Quakers. It's the do-good arm of the Quakers, the Fellowship of Friends, as they call themselves. Really nice people. If I believed in God, I'd be a Quaker. I really would. They're just nice people. So they had a project house in Chicago, down in a slum, where they would do good things in the neighborhood, and they would bring young people like us in to learn how to be do-gooders. And it was really fun, and there were girls. And you stayed overnight. It was great. I fell in love every week. It was amazing. Anyway, I wound up going in for a full summer and living in the project house, going in every day to the office and, running the addressograph machines and doing whatever needed to be done. But the civil rights movement was on. And I remember Mayor Richard J. Daley. I think, isn't his son the mayor of Chicago, or has been, or something since then? But there was to be a parade, and he was at the head of it. It was something like a brotherhood parade. And the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and Congress of Racial Equality and all the other groups, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, Martin Luther King Jr.'s organization, I belonged to all of them, and we hated this idea that this nasty politician who was doing everything he could to keep gerrymandering the city and keeping all the races separate, in their neighborhoods. He was going to stride along at the front of this thing, and it was all brotherhood. So they were going to meet at the big band shell in South Chicago, a big park, and give speeches. And I tailed along, with my sign in the parade. The sign said, "What the hell is Daley doing here?" Some people got it. But I can remember listening to this guy and getting so angry, I jumped up in my seat about halfway through the audience and shook my fist. Skinny 17-year-old kid, no beard yet. "Daley, go to hell! Daley, go to hell!" And the crowd took up the chant. It was amazing. Anyway, that was a great moment. But I almost got killed, too, one evening. You want to hear another story from Chicago?
Well, that one where you got thrown in jail.
Oh, well, yeah, we'd go to sit-ins. Remember sit-ins where you would go and you'd sit there and plug up the works? We did that. The Board of Education, because they had the school districts all gerrymandered and racist, we'd go there and have sit-ins. But we had outdoor ones one time. What the Board of Education would do is they would have a high school here, a school of any kind here, just crammed to the rafters with black kids. And in this case, almost across the street was another school, which had, a smattering of white kids in it, because the district line ran right down the middle to try to keep people segregated. That's the way it was. So rather than just putting more students into the other school, the school board would bring in these trailer classrooms on the grounds of the black school so they could put more black kids in there. And we, the civil rights people, didn't like this at all. So when they were trying to move the trailers around, we could sit in front of the trucks and all that. And I got arrested. First time in my life. I got arrested, and these big Irish cops threw me in a paddy wagon. Everybody worried about the Irish cops, not realizing that the Irish had been treated the same way as the blacks when they came to Chicago, 100 years before. But spent a night in jail, and we sang the songs, and all that stuff, and I got bailed out, and the whole thing was dropped later on. my last year in high school. Yeah, I didn't have to go to jail.
Yeah.
But I'd never been in jail before. That was interesting.
No, and did you indicate that this wasn't the last time you were in jail?
It's the only time, I think, I've actually been in jail. Okay. In Canada, they don't throw you into jail for saying, Mayor Daley, go to hell. They just kind of look at you like, what? It's much better here.
Yeah. Oh, good. Thank you. On behalf of all Canadians, thank you.
Well, I'm one too. As soon as I could, I became Canadian. And at the time, I thought, I'm done with the USA.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
But no, they never let you really go away entirely.
No. So after that time in Chicago, you went back to Colorado that you loved. Yep. You loved the outdoors. You loved nature. Yep. And you learned to climb. You got into climbing. You had started a little bit before that.
Yeah, my brother and I had got interested in rock climbing, and my grandparents had bought us a rope and some carabiners and stuff before we moved to Chicago in 1962. When I came back in 1964, I just got right into it right away. And it was, you know, trying to change the world as a radical left-winger, there were a lot of risks in that and very few rewards. But in mountaineering, there are risks, but you get to the top, right? I mean, the reward is there, and they were my people. I really believe, and some of you may know this as well, you need to find your own kind of people in this world. We climbers find each other, and it makes a huge difference in our lives. So I found my own people, mostly young people in Colorado Springs like me. We climbed the big sandstone spires of the Garden of the Gods and had many adventures, and hardly anybody got killed. Well, maybe a couple of us, but I didn't get killed, and tried to be safe and all that. Yeah. And it really changed my life, And I discovered the natural world in the process. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was big. And you went and tried to get a university education about that time, too.
My wife convinced me of that.
Yeah, so I guess that was, right. Getting ahead of myself. Your wife.
I got married in there.
You got married in there.
Yeah.
Tell us about
that. That's kind of an amusing story.
Yeah, your wedding was hilarious.
We're just going to laugh about it ourselves and not tell them. It's just too.
Yeah. Well, it was a.
Okay. Here's the story. One of the climbers I met was Cecilia Langdon, who came from Maryland, and she was a student at Colorado College in Colorado Springs, and I didn't think about going to college or university. I just wanted to overthrow the government. You know, I didn't need to do that. And I met this girl who was a climber. And they're few and far between, or not so much now, but they were then. And right away I started courting her, and she liked me. So 3 weeks later we were married. Mm. We hadn't intended to get married. We just wanted to run off together to Yosemite Valley. But she made the mistake of telling her parents what was going to happen. And they arrived on the next plane. And there were some ugly scenes in our living room. Well, my dad and her dad had words. This did not do very well. But in the end, they tried to drag her off to Denver. They took her to Denver to see a psychiatrist. Her dad was a doctor, a medical doctor, you see. So he could call up a psychiatrist in Denver, he knew. And he said, take a look at my daughter. She's running off with this skinny weirdo in Colorado Springs. So anyway, the psychiatrist talked to Sia and talked to her dad, got them both together, and said, well, Dr. Langdon, your daughter seems to be perfectly normal, and the fella she's in love with sounds really nice. Why don't you cut a deal? So the deal was, as long as we got legally married, we could run away and have sex together. So we were married on a place called St. Peter's Dome above Colorado Springs. It's right at the Front Range, a really nice place. And but there was another thing that happened in there. In order to get married in those days, you had to pass a test showing that you did not have a venereal disease. And the big one was syphilis, right? Syphilis. So you take. There were two tests: the Wasserman test, which we wanted to get married the next day, before my father-in-law to be had to go lecture to his students at Johns Hopkins Medical School where he taught. So this had to be done fast, and they just developed a new test that would tell you in about 2 hours if you had syphilis. The only trouble was it wasn't very accurate. And Sia and I both took it, and we each got a card. Hers said negative, and mine said positive. And I said, well, one of us is screwed. Who is it? I had no idea what that was. Turned out that I had flunked the test. So there was another meeting. The doctor who had the test with us, and Sia's dad, the doctor, got together, and it was decided that, because I said, we haven't even had sex. I've never had sex in my life. And it was embarrassing to admit. Here I was 19, you know, and never. And so the deal was, not only would we get married, but this doctor, would give me a big head of penicillin, which was the first shot in the treatment for syphilis, just in case I actually had it, which would make me non-contagious overnight. So I wouldn't infect Bob's daughter, Dr. Bob's daughter. So I said, okay. And it was the biggest needle I've ever seen in my life. It was like a bicycle pump syringe. And they shot all this stuff into my ass. And it went right into my hip joint. And all of a sudden I couldn't walk. And they wouldn't let me stay. This was in Denver. They would not let me stay in the same motel with Sia in case we ran off together. So they put me in a different hotel in a different part of town. It was a dive. And I'm in this motel room with my butt is just in terrible pain. Plus I'm having a reaction to the penicillin. I was allergic. So I was lying there anaphylactic, you know, standing in the shower. And I thought, wait a minute. If I actually live until tomorrow morning, this doctor is going to be my father-in-law. I'm going to call him and ask what to do. He's a doctor. He was more of a biochemist at that point. But so I said, Bob, I'm having a reaction. What should I do? And all he was thinking was, good, he's going to die. But what he said was, and I am not kidding you, take 2 aspirins and call me in the morning. It's true. And I lived. Damn it. And we got married in this beautiful place and had a nice honeymoon in a part of the Colorado Rockies Sia had never seen. Yeah. And we've been together ever since. That was September of 1965. Her parents thought this would last 3 weeks. But we have outdistanced every member of their family in marriage longevity.
Great.
By far.
Well done.
Hasn't been easy.
I hear that it never is, but good for you. That's great. And and then along in there, Will was born not too long later. Young Willie.
Little Willie. He was not conceived before our marriage. This was important in those days. We were married in 65. In 67, along comes little Willie. He was accidental. We didn't really want him. But, you know, one thing and another. And he turned out to be amazing. Little Willie. He learned to speak very early. Do any of you know my son? He's now Will Gadd. He's a famous climber, you know, and does all kinds of cool stuff. But like all the Gadds, he started to talk quite early. So when we came to Canada in 1968, we had just arrived, stayed with some friends in Lethbridge a couple of days, and we're headed over to BC, where we'd heard there were sort of Quaker communes and things that would be interesting. Maybe I could get a job there or something. And we were in Coleman, Alberta, on Will's birthday, his first birthday. Coleman, Alberta, in the evening, March the 8th, 1968. And little Willie was put in a high chair, and the waitress came out. We were the only people in the Coleman Hotel dining room. Have you ever eaten? Is it still around even? The Coleman Hotel dining room is a big old hotel. Anyway, she asked us, and what will the baby be having? And little Willie said, I'll have chicken and chips. Because he had learned that in Canada, chips were French fries. He'd learned this before he was 1. Yeah. And the waitress, whoa, and looked at Sia and said, well, if you can have those on the menu. And she brought him back. And for dessert, she brought him a little cupcake with a single candle in it for his birthday party. And we thought, what a great country.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah. So you came to Canada in March of
1968.
And we can probably understand why, but tell us sort of why you came.
Oh, right. My dad had been in the Army in World War II briefly, cracked up in the U.S. before they could send him overseas, and wound up in a military loony bin for a while before he did get a medical discharge and all that. But it left him with a hatred of all things military. He joined up, I think, to please his own dad, who was militaristic. But my father soon learned, the military was not what he thought it would be, and so he basically indoctrinated me to be completely anti-military. Other boys would play guns, not me. I'd play weapons. We had our ways of getting around our father's requirements of us. But anyway, when I got to be 18 in the U.S. back then, you had to go down to the local draft board. There were these draft boards all over the country and register. You had to sign up and sign a form saying that, yes, if I was called up, I would go and serve and shoot people out of helicopters, like some of my friends were later having to do, in Vietnam and whatnot. And there's no way I would do this. So I ignored them. Went to the University of Colorado. You had to fill out a card at every registration with your draft. You had a number, right? Selective insurance number. I didn't have one because I just ignored them. I thought maybe they would come for me because refusing to go was 2 years in prison or join up, right? Refusing to register was 10 years in prison, and they wouldn't let you join up. So it was actually pretty heavy-duty crime, as it were, But Sia understood this, and she was completely in agreement that I should have nothing to do with this whole thing. So I ignored them, and I can remember at the University of Colorado, which she talked me into going to, she said, Ben, if you're going to overthrow the government, it would help if you have a college degree, she said. So I went to the University of Colorado and discovered geology, and that's been my life ever since. But so they had these computer cards. The punch cards were kind of new back then in the mid-'60s and late 60s by then. And there was a little box you could check that said, not eligible for selective service. And I thought, that sounds good. So instead of giving them my draft card number, I just checked that box. And they never got on to me. Either that or they realized that my father, who was outspoken and well-known in Colorado for his politics, would have come down on them, whoever they were, who tried to bust me for this, like the ton of bricks he could wield with his typewriter. He's a very good journalist. And they left me alone. For whatever reason, it all ended in February of 1968 in my second full year at the University of Colorado. My wife and I were living in married student housing. And these were Quonset huts. You know what I'm talking about? We all lived in there. We said we were all living in half a sewer pipe in Vetsville, because a lot of these families were Vietnam War veterans who were able to go to school, as my dad had done actually. On what do they call it? Anyway, if you're in the military, they give you money. So we were living there, and I discovered geology. I was doing great in it. Colorado was a great place to study geology. We had great field trips, really good professors. And then one of the guys in Vetsville, who lived not far from us, and his half a sewer pipe, got to be a little too friendly. And many years ago, I had realized as a kid that when one of the local right-wingers wanted to know what my dad was doing, that person would come up to me and say, "Hey, Sam." He would mistakenly use my father's name instead of my name. He wouldn't say, "Hey, Benny." He would say, "Hey, Sam," because he was thinking of my dad, right? And this guy, who was trying to be a little too friendly, and he was a Vietnam vet, called out as we were walking up to the campus from Vetsville. He says, "Hey, Sam." Alarm bells are going off, right? And I just assumed that we were being spied upon. I belonged to Students for Democratic Society, and so on. We knew there were spies everywhere, but so far they left me alone. But this was getting a bit scary. I turned around and said, "How did you know my father's name?" He said, you know, and anyway, 3 weeks later, we were gone. By this time, we had a child, and there's no way I was going to go to jail for all those years, you know, with a young son. So we loaded my younger brother, Morgan, who had turned 18 and didn't register for the draft either. So Sia and little Willie and Morgan and I got in our 1957 Volkswagen microbus, the hippie van, right? But we weren't hippies. We didn't paint it up or anything. It was kind of red and black. It had the little windows, you know, along the top and the sunroof and the whole thing. Great climber mobile, you know. We all loaded in that and brought everything and fled north at 50 miles per hour, crossed the border at Coots late at night. And I remember sort of blithering something about, there was nobody there. To begin with, at the border, there was a sign saying you have to go inside. So we went inside. I remember going up to the counter, and we've been on the road for 2 days, and I'm so tired and really, really worried. Because if we got turned around here, we'd have to go back through the U.S. side, where I would be caught probably without a draft card and immediately arrested. So the stakes were high, right? And I blurted something about, we're going climbing at Lake Louise, because we'd heard of Lake Louise. And I remember the customs agent kind of getting a look on his face. Number one, it's early March and they want to go climbing in Lake Louise. But also, these are Dodgers. And there were two kinds of border people at that point. The ones who liked the young people coming. Petro wasn't the prime minister yet. Was it Lester Pearson before? Yeah, but he was kind of cool with all of us coming north. It's like the brain drain has been the other way, and now the smart ones were leaving the U.S. for Canada. So anyway, he said, go on, you know. And we were in. And for the first time in my entire life, I realized that no one was out to get me. This was a whole new country. And it looked so much like the U.S., it was kind of nice. People spoke English, but they said a boat, you know, and you had chips instead of fries. And, you know, it was somewhat different. Mm-hmm. And we've had this amazing life here ever since.
Wow.
Sorry, that was a long... How are we doing?
Oh, good. I think we're going to get there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm keeping an eye on it. That's my job.
All right.
Just keep it... Yeah, it's great stories.
If you try to kick me under the table, they'll see it out front.
They will. No, we're doing fine. Okay. So here in the Rockies, or in Canada, you discovered the Canadian Rockies, which aren't like the Colorado Rockies.
No. I remember when we arrived in Lethbridge, and you could just see, you know, a little bit if you got west of Lethbridge, and driving through Crow's Nest Pass, I'm looking at these huge cliffs and mountains of limestone. You know, we didn't have those in Colorado. They're all granite and whatnot, and going, my God, these mountains are amazing. Wow, you know. Fell in love then and there with the Rockies.
Yeah. No, you briefly went over to Argenta. You looked at Argenta.
Quakers.
Yeah, and lots of fellow draft dodgers.
Yeah.
And then, but very quickly you ended up in Calgary.
Yeah, there wasn't any real work there except logging. And it turned out, somebody took me aside, Ben, and said, Ben, don't get into that. You'll get killed in the first week. My brother, who was long, said, okay, and stayed because they had a lot of marijuana in Argenta, and he was a hippie in those days. He later became a university professor. So it is possible, you know, for hippies to grow up into something okay, you know. Yeah. So there were so many jobs in Calgary. We'd been told, I had 2 years in geology. And they said, just walk into oil companies in Calgary and tell them that you'd like to be a technician. Because they were hiring people to do things like color maps and stuff, you know. So I went down to different... It was funny, if I went to an American-owned company, I remember going to Amarada Hess, which I think was out of Texas, and they took a look at me and said, draft dodger, get out of here. I went to the Canadian Pacific Oil and Gas, and they said, hi, come on in. And I got a job offer in their computer department. I knew nothing about computers. Computers were new, but every oil company in Calgary was getting one. At CPOG, they bought a huge Honeywell computer that sat in the middle of the building in a room, cost $2 million, and had 32K of memory. That was it. and programmers in offices all the way around. You had to write all on programs. But the things they could do with this computer, it would draw contour maps from well logs and stuff. It was incredible. So my job was to talk to the geologists upstairs, whom I understood, and run these programs. I didn't have to write the programs. Just they showed me how to run them. You had to punch cards and feed them in. And it was a good job and gave us a good start in Calgary. It really did.
Yeah, and you bought a house right away, I think.
It was amazing. Could never have done that in the U.S. I think I was paid $500 a month. And so we started looking around, We rented for a while. But we were renting a place from a crazy Hungarian who thought we were communists or something. This is a whole story in its own. But anyway, we thought, we don't do that anymore. Let's buy a house. They were cheap. Bonus, we bought a decent little 2-bedroom bungalow near the park, but not in the expensive row of houses by the park, right? We were a couple of blocks in the kind of slums, as if this city had any slums. We went looking for slums, thinking that's the place that's cheap to rent. I asked. There weren't any. It was Canada. People were doing okay, Anyway, $8,900 later, we owned a house in Calgary. My grandparents coughed up $2,000 for the down payment.
Yeah.
And we have never looked back, Once you buy a house, we bought one in Jasper, back in Canmore.
Yeah.
We've got a nice place to live, all because of that little cracker box.
Yeah.
Bonus.
Yeah.
Anybody here from Bonus? Know of Bonus?
And you started climbing. You discovered the Calgary Mountain Club, all those Brits.
I did. I'm trying to think how that happened. But I remember thinking, I know what it was. We drove up to Moraine Lake, and there was this big gully of snow that came down from the ridge to the lake. And in Colorado, you would climb mountains if you were a mountaineer by kicking steps in snow and going up gullies. And in rock climbing too, but the snow gullies were fun because then you could turn around and glissade down them, right? You could hang onto your ice axe and slide on your boots or your butt or something. So Jim White, who was another axe yank up here, and I decided that we would climb this gully. And I know what it was. Brian Greenwood worked at Premier Sports in Calgary.
Yeah.
And I had to buy some equipment, and somehow I found out that Brian was a climber and knew about the routes. So I asked Brian, what's it like to climb this couloir? I'd learned couloir. It's Canada, right? It's French. In the U.S., it was just gully. Gully. Couloir. And he said, well, you might find a little bit of ice. Bring your crampons. That's all he said. So we tried to climb this thing. And like 12 hours later, we still weren't at the top. Boulders were rumbling down this thing trying to kill us. And I realized we had bitten off more than we could chew. And all of a sudden I had enormous respect for the Canadian Rockies and how easily they can kill you. But we made it.
Yeah.
And we didn't know that at the top there was a mountain hut. A little silver box. Apparently they would build them at SAIT or something like this.
Yeah.
Dick Lofthouse, because he taught at SAIT. Anyway, wow, because it was getting dark, and we're way up there, and we had no way we could go down. We didn't have a map as to how to go off the other side. And here is a little hut with Hudson Bay blankets folded up in a box, and food, and a Coleman stove with white gas in it. In the U.S., that would be vandalized and destroyed 5 minutes after it was built. But this is Canada, right? And not only that, there was a map that showed the trail to get down to Tokum Creek and on out, to Marble Canyon. So we were going to live.
Yeah.
So that was my introduction to climbing in Canada. And, of course, then I had to get into the Calgary Mountain Club.
Yeah.
If for no other reason to say to Brian, you should have told us more about that climb. But that's the way they were, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, just they'll do okay.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Good. And you discovered Yamnuska too.
That was really, really cool. I'd always liked rock climbing, but was pretty afraid. It took me a long time when I was young to get into it because I'm terribly afraid of heights. But once that part of my brain burned out, the fear of heights part, I think this is what happens. I liked rock climbing, and Yamnuska, wow, this was the Calgary Mountain Club. What would you call it? It's kind of their mountain in a way. And remember the old guidebook, the original little guidebook that was done there? You did climbs, a lot of climbs on Yamnuska, and they were long, and some were easy, and others were hard. And it was limestone, which is totally different from the granite or the sandstone I'd been climbing on in Colorado. Yeah. But it was fun. It had a lot of holes. Yeah. Yeah, so I just loved Yamnuska.
Yeah. It was a good time in the Calgary Mountain Club and a great place. And you went back to school. You finished your degree.
Yeah, I tried to go for a year at the University of Calgary in honors geology, and that didn't last long. It was so different. It was more initiation rite than education. I hate to say that. Any retired or current U of C profs here, the ones from those days have probably all retired and died. But they were just really out to put the students through something. And at the University of Colorado, it was a whole different attitude. They wanted to show you how wonderful this subject was. And I learned so much from friendly professors, who gave exams that were fun to take. They were hard, but they were cool. And this was all, memorize these 500 names. Did any of you have Samuel Nelson for a professor at the University of Calgary? I'm hearing some, this guy really did a number on me, and I won't go into it, but I dropped out.
Yeah.
Thinking that's that. Yeah.
And then, but you did get your degree through Lethbridge.
University of Lethbridge had a new program. My brother lived in Lethbridge, and he had enrolled in something they called colloquium study, which was you make deals with professors to teach you things. These were the hippie 70s, right? And I think a lot of the U of L professors had discovered marijuana or something, but anyway, it was pretty neat. I knew what I wanted to learn. I wanted to learn the geology of the Canadian Rockies. I had the basics at the University of Colorado, and I did 2 long studies of mapping. One was mapping an area along the North Saskatchewan River at the mountain front where there was no geological map, and another was doing some studies of stream courses in southern Alberta. And for my advisors, I had top-notch geologists from the Geological Survey of Canada who sort of stepped in, and the guy in charge of the program at the University of Lethbridge says, hey, if he's got a PhD, we'll accept him, So I wound up learning what I wanted to learn, the basic geology of the Canadian Rockies in my final 2 years. And we didn't live in Lethbridge, we lived in Calgary, and I was all independent study. And I would go down once a month or so to check in with my advisors down there.
Great.
Morgan did the same thing. He was into anthropology and biology and worked on the ethnobotany of the Blackfoot and did a really nice monograph on that. Wow. And got his degree the same way. Yeah.
Wow. And you got your degree in geology, but...
Earth science. They have no geology department.
And what you really wanted, I thought you said, was a degree in natural history.
Well, I was getting interested in natural history. That's true. I liked wildflowers and the names of things and all that. But there just was no degree in natural history at U of C, U of A, or U of L in those days.
Even though it was the oldest science.
Well, that's what they called it back at the beginning, wasn't it? Natural history. But of course, it was later broken down and pigeonholed by the reductionists and became all these different departments. So I settled on earth science, and it's always been my favorite. I just really like mountains and how they're put together and how they formed and all that. And then wound up becoming a park interpreter and passing that along. Yeah.
But somehow you ended up teaching at SAIT.
English.
Teaching English, How did you move to SAIT?
At SAIT, at least in 1976, they didn't care so much what you had after your name. It's what you could teach. And I had been a technical editor at a consulting company in Calgary for long enough to really learn all about reports and proposals and business letters and all this stuff, which I edited and wrote for this company. And an ad came out in the paper. I tried to go out on my own, started my own little consulting company, called it the Word Works. And I was going to edit technical reports for whoever companies hired me to do it in Calgary. It didn't work because what consultant is going to allow their report out to somebody they don't know to be edited, right? I didn't understand that. So after going broke at that, I just had to get a job. So along came an ad saying, it didn't call it an English teacher. It was like communications or something longer. And I walked in there with my guide to technical reports that I had written for this company I worked for, and they hired me because I knew that stuff, Yeah. And it was fun. I got to teach speech. And any of you who have been to SAIT or taught at SAIT know that you don't have to read novels in class at SAIT. You learn how to spell. And I learned how to teach that stuff and loved it. And the students seemed to like me. I got good reviews and would have probably stayed there a long time. But in 1980, we thought, let's just get out of Calgary. Let's go to Jasper and live in the Rockies. And we did.
Yeah.
That was the last full-time job I had.
Yeah.
Teaching at SAIT in 1980. Yeah.
Yeah. And but on your way to Jasper, you spent a winter at Hilda Creek.
That's right. By this time, I was writing for Parks Canada on contract, kind of moonlighting, right? Writing interpretive signs and reports for them and stuff. And they wanted me to write a book. I have some books with me. Some of you may have seen this book. Here it is. Bankhead, right? So they said, Ben, we want you to write a book about Bankhead. And Bankhead was a big deal in 1979. They had money for interpretation, and that's when they put in those exhibits, and turned the Transformer building into an exhibit there at the where they had the mines and all that. So I got a contract, and we by this time I'd taken leave at SAIT. We went on a big trip down through the U.S. deserts, up until Christmas, and then moved into Hilda Creek Hostel, and I wrote this book, and back in 10 or 5 or whenever Bankhead got started, they had electric lights. And here I was writing a book about them on a manual typewriter with a kerosene lamp. But a few weeks later, the hostel guy came around and put in propane. We had propane lighting. That was an improvement.
An improvement, yeah.
But that turned into a fun little project, yeah.
Yeah. And you had a wonderful winter with Sia and Ben, and Toby was here by then.
Toby was born in 1970, so we had 2 boys. And they both had really got into skiing. They were quite young. Toby, I think, was only, he was only 10. And Will was 3 years older, so he was skiing all this amazing stuff. We'd go to the Columbia Icefield, and got into all this backcountry skiing, ski mountaineering stuff. I didn't discuss that at all, but that was what everybody was doing, in the mountains in those days. And I can always remember Willie had this ski run set up in between the hostel buildings. You go way up, it's 200 yards up on Parker Ridge, and come whistling down between the hostel buildings as fast as he could go. And we'd see this by the windows and think, I hope he doesn't hit one of these buildings, Yeah. The other thing I remember about Willie that winter is that he turned into quite a climber and all that, but can you imagine trying to raise this kid? We were teaching them ourselves. By this time, we'd started a school with some friends in Calgary. It was called the Saturday School, and it was a Monday to Friday school based a lot on a school in England. What did they call that? It was kind of a free school sort of thing, an early one. But anyway, the hippie 70s, right? And so we just said, well, we'll keep teaching them at home, and they said, that's fine. At the hostel, that's fine. But Willie hated math and numbers, and he would just bluntly refuse to do it, and he'd become really aggressive and nasty and calling us names, and in this tiny cabin, being a complete shit. So I remember one time picking him up and throwing him out the door into the snow. It was probably minus 30. Child abuse, right?
Yeah.
He deserved it. And he stood out there in bare feet, looking at me. And I was thinking, frostbite. We caved in and let him in. And he did the math. This was our relationship with education that winter up there. Toby was much nicer and easier to deal with.
Yeah.
But they did learn to ski, and we had a wonderful winter up there.
Yeah.
And that's when we decided, let's move to Jasper.
Yeah.
And we moved the following summer.
Yeah, and you got that beautiful house on, was it on Patricia Street? Where was it?
The house in Jasper was on Geeky Street.
On Geeky Street.
Geeky. Can you imagine living on Geeky Street? Turns out Archibald Geeky was a famous fellow, you know, and his name always gets mispronounced, Geeky.
Yeah.
He was Scottish, maybe it was right, but I heard it was really geeky.
Yeah.
But we sold that place, and this is amazing. We wanted to move to Cougar Creek, which is where Will and his partner lived. By this time, they had a granddaughter, so we were driving down from Jasper all the time, to be with them. And we decided, okay, we'll move to Canmore. It was a 5-minute decision. I remember sitting around the table once with with Will and his partner Kim, and it's getting kind of late, and it's winter time, and we have to drive back to Jasper on the Icefields Parkway, which we called the Parkfields Iceway in the winter, and with good reason. And we're just, but something was going to happen the next day. I had to be there. And Kim said, why don't you two just move down here? We could use the babysitting. And I looked at Sia, and she looked back, and we said, okay.
Yeah.
It took a year to sell the house.
Yeah.
But the cool part of it is that we were living in the basement at Will's place, Will and Kim's place, and we had a dog, a border collie, and Sia was out walking it, and here came another person with a dog, and it was a little dachshund, and they got to talking, and the guy said, "Are you the people staying in Will's house?" And Sia said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, we live in the house across the back fence. That's how come we know we've seen you. Are you thinking of moving to Canmore?" And Sia said, "Oh, don't we wish?" And he said, "Why don't you buy my house?"
Yeah.
They wanted to sell, but they had a son who was nuts and would smash the place up. And they couldn't put it on the market in that condition. And the guy was a chef at the Banff Center. A nice family. But this one kid was the sort of who would just sort of crack up and start breaking things. They wanted to move to Red Deer, where his psychiatrist lived or something, and we said, location, location, location. We don't care what the inside of the house looks like. We'll get an appraisal on what it costs to get it fixed. Let's set up a price, take that off, and we'll buy it. And that was that.
Yeah.
So we wound up being, this is amazing, Grandma and Grandpa across the backyard. This is one house, this is the other house,
Wow.
The fence in the middle came down 10 minutes after we got possession. Will just pushed it over. And that was 2009. And we've had, what is that, 10, 12, 13 really, really good years.
Good. Well, we sort of skipped over the Jasper years, though.
Well, Jasper's boring,
Okay. That's where you wrote handbook.
Well, that's where I worked for Parks Canada as a park naturalist for 3 summers, and then Mulrooney government came in. Brian Mulrooney's government cut the funding and sort of the whole. It wasn't fun to be a park naturalist anymore. I could have done that job every summer the rest of my life, Chick. It was so much fun being out with the public and doing the shows and the campground theaters and all that stuff. It was just so much fun. But it all kind of went south when the Mulrooney government came in, and from the minister on down, it just got nasty. It was all about work, 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 and wear the uniform all the time, and you're not allowed to say this, and you have to say that, and wow. And I realized then I needed to write this book because I needed to have it with me, with all this information. People are always asking me, what's that wildflower, what's that bird, and so on. And I learned a lot of them, but I needed the information. So I thought, I'm going to write a book and call it the Rocky Mountain Manual. And in 1982, I quit my job, and it's the strangest thing, really bittersweet. My dad had already died in 1974 of heart disease, which kills most of the Gadd boys, by the way. Already got 1 stent, right? but I've outlived him by a good many years. I'm almost 76. Anyway, she died of brain cancer. They both smoked, right? And it was all related to that. And so there was a little money, not very much, mainly from her parents in Springfield, who had died before. And my mother, before she died, said, Ben, you're thinking of writing this book about the Rockies. I said, yeah, I'd really like to do it. And I had tried, but I'm having to earn a living, you know, and this was a big job. Have you seen this book? Where is it? I just happen to have a copy on me. This one, right? Handbook of the Canadian Rockies. Whoop, that one wasn't supposed to come up yet. All right. So, and she said, why don't you use that money? It's like $30,000 or something, not a lot. But it was enough to live on. We spent it out 4 years. And doing a little work, too. I didn't work as a park naturalist anymore. I just didn't want to. It wasn't fun. And wrote that thing. And it came out in 1986. And I have never looked back. If you want to be thought of as somebody who knows something, write a book about it. You know this. So do some of you, right? And now, when I was hired to get on the front end of buses and take people for hikes and do that stuff, and the kind of things Parks Canada didn't do. Parks Canada was not doing much interpretation in the late 80s and early 90s. And this was my calling card, you know.
Yeah.
Plus, I could sell them at my events.
Yeah. And in the end, it was good financially for you, too, I think.
This just keeps making money for us.
Yeah.
I self-published it. I had offers. It's funny, I had offers from several publishers, but the ones who wanted to give me a decent advance wanted to take it over, and I'd never see it again. And I was really worried because Lone Pine books, you know, the whole Lone Pine series, at the time, they weren't very good. A lot of mistakes in those books. And I didn't want them messing up my book. And then the people who were willing to do it the way I wanted to didn't want to pay us enough money for it. So Sia and I thought, well, how hard can this be? I was already editing books, following in my dad's footsteps. And I had also learned to do the design, the layout, the paste up. You know, I could produce this thing. So I did. And there's a picture in my memoir, which I think Glenn has in the back at the moment, of Sia and I working on the light table late at night, pasting up the old... Did any of you have the original old black and white version of this book? Yeah. Doing that. We took it to Winnipeg to a printer who had given us a good bid, put all the big spreads in a suitcase and got on the train and took it to Winnipeg and got it printed.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, we had a garage full of books to sell.
Yeah.
But that turned out to be kind of fun. We loaded up our old Subaru and drove all over the place. I just go up to a bookstore or a drugstore or a sporting goods store, any place that might sell a book like this, and say, here's this book that's all about the Rockies. And you're either in or near them, and I think people will buy this. I remember some of them were dubious. I think it was in High River. There were some good old boys in the drugstore. No, it was a sporting goods store, kind of a gun shop. And the good old boys were in there, and I was talking to the boss, and these two guys came up, and one of them says, "What's that?" And I said, "Well, this is, by now, the handbook of the Canadian Rockies." I had changed the title. And I said, "It's just about anything you want to know." "Oh, come on. Well, let me look at that." You know? So they're thumbing through it, you know. And then one of them says, "Well, hey, he's got an item on bighorn sheep in here." And he looks at me and says, "How much?" and at that point, the gun shop owner said, "I'll take 5." And that's the way it went, all up and down the Rockies and down into Montana. It never sold many in Montana, even though it's kind of included in here because of Glacier Park.
Yeah.
Is really part of Waterton Lakes. Don't tell them the border should bump south around Glacier Park, Montana. I think we could trade them something, like maybe Sudbury or something, you know.
Yeah.
Anybody here from Sudbury? Yeah. But that's what we did. So I was author, layout artist, a salesperson, paste up, you know, shipping boy, everything.
Yeah.
On the old black and white version of that book. And it did very well.
Yeah, yeah. Any idea how many copies you've sold over the years by now?
It must be in the hundreds of thousands. I never keep track of these things, but at one point we printed 20,000 black and white first editions and sold them in a few years.
Wow.
Now, since we're all friends here, I can give you the truth about what's in here. I made it all up, check it.
Well, they're good going. That makes it even more amazing that you could be that creative. Yeah.
No, we got letters right off the bat. There's so much information in there, and the typos and the mistakes. I remember getting a letter from a fish biologist who said, in reference to, I forget what the species was in the fish section, he said, if this fish had the dimensions you provide, it would be the shape of a bowling ball. So we were always enjoying the letters we got from people, and sometimes they were wrong, but usually they were right. There were things that needed to be fixed.
Oh yeah, no matter how hard you try, the errors get in there. And then that led to more books. Of course, the big one, your geology road book.
I just happen to have a copy.
Oh, you just happen to have
So I just haul them all out. Maybe I'll just
okay.
Not to show them to you, but just to, okay. So I brought 4 of my books in print. This is the geology book, Canadian Rockies Geology Road Tours. So it's what you see from the car window. Written in everyday English and supposedly easy to understand, but it's not, because you can't write easy to understand geology very well. And then this one, how many of you have seen my only novel? Oh, thank you. You see, this is a work of fiction, but this one is advertised as such. And a lot of it takes place on Yamnuska, and it has climbers. And,
tell us a little bit about Raven's End. Like all the birds and all the people in there, like John and Linda and all that sort of stuff, they're all real people. They're all Calgary Mountain Club.
Some of them are, it was Boogs, B-O-O-G-S. Have any of you read the novel? Do you know the story at all? There's a Scottish character in there called Boogs, B-O-O-G-S, Bugs McKeith, who got killed falling through a cornice on the summit of Yamnuska. And he's in the book. Oh, maybe I shouldn't give away too much of the story.
No, I'll bet.
Okay, I'll give it away. Sorry. But he's in the story. John Martin and Linda Howard, 2 good friends of mine, are in there as John and Linda, who appear a couple of times. I checked with it first. They said they wouldn't mind as long as I didn't tell them anything truthful. And there are other characters. The real joy of this book is that it gets used in schools. From grade 5 up through grade 8. Teachers, how are we doing? We're going to have to end this.
No, we're doing fine.
Teachers like to use this book. It can be read. It's not really, I didn't write down. It's kind of high school graduate level. But a smart grade 5 student can read this book. And they really like it in schools because it has good messages about things. And there's natural history in there. And so I get invited to go to schools and read to the students. I'm going to 3 of them next week.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's one of the great pleasures of my latter years here, is to stand up in front of all these smiling kids who make raven noises with me. Rockata! And all this stuff. And it's just a heap of fun.
Yeah.
And that it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't decided to write a novel.
Yeah. And I think you've had a real connection with ravens over the years.
Well, like the newly slain knight. They like to pick the eyes out of dead climbers. Ravens do.
Okay.
Not really. Come on. No. Just the ravens on Yamnuska. Chick, you'll be doing this. You're right on the hardest move of the climb, and up there, and some raven will just fly by and go, sort of like, stick it, which is something you don't say in a bar, but to a climber means stay on the rock.
Yeah.
Now the raven may be saying, if you wouldn't mind falling off, I would like to pluck out your eyeballs. But I've always just loved these birds. They're fascinating, and if I'd been a biologist, I would have studied them.
Yeah.
They're so smart. They do all kinds of cool things.
Yeah, your publishing company is Corax.
Yeah, we did that. We decided to start self-publishing. Corax. Corvus corax is the scientific name of the raven.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
It's like Corax just sounds like it ought to be a corporation somehow.
Yeah. And then, of course, you wrote your autobiography.
Yes, and that one's over there with Glenn somewhere. It's thick and heavy. Don't bother trying to pick it up, Glenn, and bring it over. He's going to do it anyway. That's my last big book. I'm not writing any more books.
No, you've
taken years off my life.
You like writing big books.
That's what a review of, I think it was a review of this book, which is 500 and some pages. The reviewer said, "This is an author who cannot write short books." Yeah, this one clocks in at what is it, 600 or something? 632. But check the title, those of you in the front row there. An Orogenous Life. Now, this was Sia's idea, this name, orogenous. Orogenous has to do with mountains, especially the geological process of mountain building, right? An orogeny, like the Rockies are an orogeny, anything orogenous. But we thought, people are going to buy this book thinking it's about sex. and right at the front, may I read something short, just for fun?
Sure.
The author is expected to read something from his books. Okay, this is not going to take long. Author's explanation and apology. Orogenous means of or about mountains, especially as a scientific term for the geological activity of mountain building. The word is easily confused with erogenous. If you bought this book because you thought there would be a lot of sex in it, you will be disappointed. Second paragraph. Last one, check, okay. Sorry about that. I won't be hurt if you return your purchase to the shop. Just explain your error to the salesperson, and I'm sure that your money will be refunded. You got to have a little fun,
Ben.
Are we finished about?
Just that last one little bit that we had talked about, just your last thoughts on, your whole life has been devoted to, in your own way, making this a better world. What is your opinion, particularly on parks and commercialization and development, all that sort of stuff?
You mean this audience can't guess?
Yeah.
No, the national parks should not be run by a single politician in Ottawa. If you go to my website, you'll see an item there under downloads that I think is the solution to the problem of the commercial sector getting so much of the national parks for their own purposes and all the rest of it, the troubles, the political problems. The national parks need to be run by a commission, an old-fashioned commission of people appointed on the basis of merit by an all-party committee of parliament. Anyway, this is in a kind of an essay, a description of this, about how to save the national parks. Yeah. And if you go to my website, bengadd.com, you can read it, and I think it would work, actually, to turn the parks away from their present course towards basically more and more and more of Banff kind of a thing, Yeah. But I'm not saying anything more about that.
No.
I'm not opinionated about these.
Oh, Ben, that's fabulous. Thank you.
You're welcome.